All right, Pam, if you could introduce yourself and what you do.
Hi, I'm Pamela Nickel-Williams, and I've been an educator for my entire life. But recently, a year ago, I published my very first book, which is called Clearly Lies Are True. It's my memoir about growing up in the cult of Scientology. So now I'm an author as well.
And for reference.
Thanks,
Okay.
Jesse.
And then what inspired you to write your memoir?
I'm not sure I was inspired. So when I've shared this, it's kind of twisty and turny. I'll try to give you the shortest version of it. About 15 years ago, I experienced a traumatic event in my life. And that traumatic event brought about some repressed memories. It activated those repressed memories. And many of those memories were about sexual abuse that I suffered at the hands of my father when I was a child. And so I didn't know what to do with those memories. They were frightening. I didn't know what to do with them. So I just started journaling and just trying to get them out of my head and onto paper and dealing with them that way. And through that writing, I started to also think about childhood memories and growing up in the cult of Scientology. I'm a second generation Scientologist, so that means my parents were first generation and I was born into Scientology. I had lots of childhood memories of Scientology, things that we did as a family, things that I did when I was a teenager. And so I started to just put them all down on paper. And I started to think about, wow, this is a chronology not only of my life, but also of the Church of Scientology. I call it the cult of Scientology, but they call it a church. And so I started to put all that down on paper and I saw that I had a story. And I didn't really know what to do with that story for a very long time. I wrote secretly. I didn't even tell my family I was writing. I just needed to deal with it on my own terms. And finally, about 4 or 5 years ago, I seriously considered writing it as a book. And I worked briefly with a small publishing company and really a literary agent. And then I decided that I wanted to self publish it. I wanted to be in charge of my own story. And so I published it in August of 2025. And it's out there now and it's really taken on a life of its own, which I never imagined. Every day is a little surreal in that I never imagined myself as an author, and I never imagined that I would speak out against Scientology, and I never imagined that I would have all these opportunities to share my story. I've been at lots of book festivals. I go into Barnes and Noble's bookstores and I share my book and my story, and I've had book signings, and it's pretty unreal.
Well, congratulations for one for doing that.
Thanks.
And that's awesome with this realness that's happening too. What made you want to join Scientology?
So nothing. So I had no choice. I had absolutely no choice in that I was born into Scientology. And so that's where my story is a little bit unique. Many people have written memoirs about Scientology. So mine is unique in that my parents were early first followers of L. Ron Hubbard, who was the founder of Scientology. And my father read his book Dianetics, the Modern Science of Mental Health, that was published in 1950. And he was all in. He was a true believer of everything L. Ron Hubbard espoused about the reactive mind and the way you can clear out those memories and become free of them. So when Scientology began a few years later, and L. Ron Hubbard went to Washington, D.C. to start the first Church of Scientology, my parents followed him. And so they worked side by side with him and his wife, and his family was there. He had children at the time, and that's where I was born. And my parents were all in as Scientologists. And once L. Ron Hubbard left, though, to go over to the UK to grow Scientology over there and to avoid taxes, basically, my parents chose not to follow him over there at that time. And we moved around the United States and we followed different organizations in Scientology. And I write about all that in my memoir. And eventually we did go over to St. Hill Manor, which is where L. Ron Hubbard grew Scientology in the UK. And my mother and my little brother and I were there. I write about that in my memoir. We got on the very first ship that L. Ron Hubbard bought for what he called his sea organization. And that was really, again, to avoid taxes, to sail out into the Mediterranean Sea, to not be able to have to pay taxes because UK was coming after him. And we sailed around, and my mom received Scientology training and auditing on the ship, but I was a small child. I was about 9 years old. So we were in a nursery with other Scientology kids, And it was some pretty bizarre times. So I write all about that in my memoir. And then we came back and we came to Los Angeles in 1968 because the organization was growing here. Scientology was booming in LA. And so my mother came out and then we followed her. And that's really where my Scientology path began when I was a teenager.
You're my first I've ever talked to that was, I guess Andrew would have been my other one, but born into a specific cult. So this is really cool to have you on. So thank you so much for being here. What did your courses consist of?
So as a teenager, well, backtrack. So when we were in St. Hill, when we were in the UK, and my mother was studying there and getting training and auditing, I took a children's communication course. I only know of it because I have a certificate that my mother saved. I have really no recollection of it besides being in a room with other kids. So I don't really remember that very first course, but when I started being active in Scientology as a teenager, I took lots of courses. And so the first one was, again, the communication course. And in Scientology, like many cults, there's a hierarchy of learning, a hierarchy of knowledge, a hierarchy of attainment. And so they rope you in early with a simple course. This one is about making you a better listener, making you able to, speak to people, but it's really just a ploy to get you to pay money and to become more involved. So that's where I started. And, my parents were paying. And then other courses that were really built on the doctrine of L. Ron Hubbard. So L. Ron Hubbard was what they called source. And he is still considered the source of all knowledge in Scientology, the source of anything that you would learn in Scientology. Nothing else can be considered, only what he has written. And so you study all of his bulletins, all of his writing, you have to read many of his books, and then you have to show that you understand everything that he said. You have to demonstrate your understanding. And in these courses, what you have to do, and I write about it in my book, you have to show representation of it. So they give you clay, and you have to, like Play-Doh, and you have to mold the clay into representations of words that you've learned and situations that you've learned about. And you have to demonstrate that. And then there's a course supervisor that walks around to monitor, to make sure that everybody is doing what they're supposed to be doing. A little bit like school.
Very much
But,
so. It actually
yeah,
reminds me of my preschool days of parrying because
yeah,
we definitely did the clay thing.
yeah,
Just with family members that are young now, I
right,
do clay and Play-Doh. That's
yeah,
wow. That's
yeah.
relatable for people.
Yeah, it is. But bizarre as adults in that even though it can help you because you're taking that understanding and you're putting it into an object so that that kinesthetic helps you and being able to transfer that knowledge that way, really I think the purpose in Scientology was more to control you and to say this is the way that you have to do it, not like if this works for you, let's try that. Everybody had to do that. And so there's such a rigid doctrine in Scientology and so many rigid protocols for all of the training and even, for the auditing. So that was some of my early coursework. And then I became an auditor.
And can you describe what an auditor is and what role you play in being an auditor?
Right. So in Scientology and in other cults, the auditor is really that person who is not necessarily more enlightened in Scientology, but more trained. So you've been trained to be this listener. You've been trained to follow the Scientology protocols and that series of questions to ask to help what they call a pre-clear. So somebody who has not yet cleared their reactive mind. So in Scientology, they believe that, all those memories, they call them aberrations that are in your head or in your reactive mind need to be cleared out and you need to be freed of those to attain this state of clear, which is where your reactive mind is not influencing your actions and your behavior. And there's levels and levels and levels of that. So as an auditor, you're helping that pre-clear get to those levels. And part of that auditing is also activating not only memories from this lifetime, but Scientology believes that you're an infinite being and that you've lived forever and ever and ever. And so you have memories from billions of years, infinity, all the way back. And so you're trying to help them clear out all of those memories. And that was a very bizarre experience as a teenager
I
because
would
I was
say.
a very young auditor. I was between 13 and 15 were my auditing years. And so in Scientology, which sounds so bizarre to, to other people, like, how could you have done that? You weren't even an adult, right? But in Scientology, they believe that you're a thetan. Everyone is a thetan. So a thetan is this infinite being that's lived forever and ever and ever. So you've lived all these lifetimes. So you just happen to be in this lifetime on this earth in this young body. That's how I was perceived when I was a child at the Scientology organizations. And so people would even say that to me. It's so cool, that you're here in this young body doing this now and getting it while you're young. So it was a very, strange perspective. But that said, as a teenager, who doesn't want to be grown up? So I wanted to feel grown up. I wanted to be grown up. I wanted to participate in all these things that adults were doing. When I was at the organization, I was the youngest person there. And so that really fed me in that I felt so grown up and I felt like I was doing something that was so important. So becoming an auditor was exciting.
That makes sense. And it's just like ascension coaching, everything you described too, since something that's taught in Twin Flames Universe by Jeff and Shalia is that you are an infinite, pretty much like that. You've lived many lives and you have to get rid of those sins that you have had. So if you do have a disability or are not to normal standards, that means you're being punished from a past life was part of that. But an ascension coach, we're supposed to help clear and heal the core issue that you're having in the moment, whether that's being your authentic self or trying to think of other things they use, just things that are blocking you from your twin flame, who's yourself, literally just a mirror of yourself. Just
I think
reminds
they,
me,
yeah,
different language, but same thing.
yeah, yeah. Are you sure they didn't read L. Ron Hubbard's book
Probably, like
and
they do a
just
lot of
mirror it?
Nexium stuff too.
Yeah, yeah. I think they just pulled from everything.
I think
That's for
so.
sure.
They have zero train of thoughts of their own. Like, I know right now they're going towards neurodivergence by claiming they themselves are neurodivergence, which, if you go backwards in time to the beginning of their making of Twin Flames universe, they really didn't like anyone who's not normal. I will continue doing that.
Right, right. But so similar to Scientology and to L. Ron Hubbard because, he talks so much in his early writing and Dianetics and his early writing about, he was homophobic, those were people that were, like sociopaths to him. I mean, he talked about that. He talked about sexual predators. He talked about all of those things. But at the same time, he also condoned it through some other writing and some other things that he said, within his writing. So he was always playing both sides. He was so anti psychiatry, anti anything, that would have outed, his beliefs that he had created this modern science of mental health. So, it's the same playbook,
It is. It's
just a different
exactly
cult.
yeah, different cult, same playbook. Like they
Same
even
playbook.
actually it was a Canadian show, like criminal investigation show. Her name is Avery Hines. She's pretty awesome. She did an interview with Jeff and Shalia, and Jeff talked about, oh, no, no, we don't claim to be psychologists or helping people. And then, like a month or two later on his YouTube channel, he goes, yes, we can help you in these areas, which are, in fact, psychology.
Exactly.
So he literally went right against what he said and claimed on live TV in Canada
Yeah.
of no, we don't do that. And then clearly you do. You just went against what you just said.
Right. Right. Yeah. And again, I think that's just part of the nature of being that cult leader because, you're trying to sell it every which way. I mean, that's was L. Ron Hubbard's purpose was to make money. He was a pulp science fiction writer in the 40s. And he wasn't making a lot of money, writing science fiction. And the famous quote that's been attributed to him is, "You don't get rich writing science fiction; you get rich starting a religion." And
That's true.
that's pretty much what he did.
Yeah. And one fact that I don't think everyone seems to understand is not all cults have religious background, sometimes that happens second. So like Twin Flames universe wasn't that way at first. The focus was just, well, I guess they still had the God idea. It came in a little later, like a year later of them opening up things, but it's not all about religion. Religion becomes a part of it when they need to have more control, I think, of the situation, in my personal opinion.
And tax exempt status.
And that too, they can keep more money for themselves. Jeff and Shalia even say it themselves. Well, Jeff mainly, he talks the most, but they're both equally, in my personal opinion, guilty. Anyway.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, that's the whole story of L. Ron Hubbard, it's just he kept moving because of the tax exempt status, being able to have all the money. Yeah.
Yeah, that's what it's about, money
Yeah.
and bodies and having enough bodies to make that money for you. So it's pretty much like America on steroids, I think a cult is. Because sell, sell, sell.
Definitely a capitalist organization. I would agree with that.
The
I
best
would,
way I could describe it.
yeah, I would definitely agree with that. Yeah, it is
Um,
interesting. So many parallels.
there's a lot of parallels. It's insane.
Yeah.
Oh, what was daily life like for you in the cult?
So there's in Scientology, there are public Scientologists. So those are the paying members, right? We're talking about all the money they make. And then there was what L. Ron Hubbard devised in the 60s. And so that was 67. We were in the UK, and that's when he bought this ship. And we boarded that ship. And that was the very first voyage, the maiden voyage of that ship. It was called the Royal Scotsman, but really it was renamed later to be called the Apollo, after one of the gods. But he started that to create what he called the Sea Project. But it was really to create a crew to run this ship so that he could sail the Mediterranean and avoid taxes and, recluse himself from being in charge, being the CEO of Scientology, and just become a writer who was, out in the sea writing. And so that really helped him with avoiding all those taxes and keeping the money. But that Sea organization grew and grew and grew from that. And so today, the Sea organization are and were back then even, they're the indentured slaves. They are the people that sign billion-year contracts to be in the Sea organization and to dedicate their entire lives to Scientology. They make very little money, less than minimum wage. They get housing and food. They work over 40 hours a week. They have no say in how their day is scheduled. They are at the mercy of all of the officials at Scientology that they work under. So that was established, like I said, in the 60s. But public Scientologists continued. And so public Scientologists are the people like my parents and my family that were always paying members, except for that short period of time when my parents worked at the First Church of Scientology, with L. Ron Hubbard. But then they became paying Scientologists. And paying Scientologists over time, from let's say the 50s till now, have changed in that Scientology has started to target what they call the whales. So the whales are like those celebrities, those people, that have tons and tons of money. So everybody knows about the celebrities, Tom Cruise, John Travolta, Elizabeth Moss, we all know about those. But there are also people that have infiltrated into government. There's Grant Cardone. There's a woman named Trish Dugan. She's on the board at the Kennedy Center. And so these are whales. These are millionaires who have tons and tons of money. And so Scientology has put their hooks in those people. And that's where they're getting them involved and getting them to pay lots and lots of money. So living as a Scientologist depends on who you are. If you have lots of money, you're treated quite well. And, you might think that Scientology is really helping you because you're treated really like a celebrity, those people that have tons of money. If you're in the Sea organization, you know nothing else. You've dedicated your life to that. And people who have dedicated years and years to a cult, we know there's this mentality of, well, I'm never going to get out. This is just my life, right? And they know nothing else. And so sadly, that's true for so many people that are in the Sea organization. And then for, regular Joes, kind of like my parents were, they were not wealthy, we were middle class. Scientology sticks their hooks in those people. And that's what happened to our family is that my parents paid so many, hundreds of thousands of dollars, thinking about, the 60s through the 70s into Scientology, that they lost their home, they lost their savings, they gave up everything to Scientology. So life was chaotic as the child of a Scientologist in that we were always following it. We were always going to the next place. And the other part of that is that there's always somebody within a cult that, is the broken one. That's why you're in a cult, right? Because they're going to fix you.
Yeah.
They're going to help you because you've got this ruin in Scientology, you've got this problem, you've got this reactive mind. And so that's how they draw you in. And that's what happened to my mom. My mom was the one that always needed to be fixed. And that was according to my father, and that was according to Scientology. And so that's why we kept following it and why she kept going for more training and more auditing. And, of course, it never fixed her. Sadly, it never fixed her. And we were able to leave, when I was about 16 years old, which was good. But the sad part of that is that my father contracted multiple sclerosis when I was a teenager. And so Scientology, he was no longer any good to Scientology because he couldn't work anymore and they had no money. And then my mother had to go back to work. She suffered from severe agoraphobia during that period of time prior to going back to work. She had psychotic episodes while she was involved in Scientology. So it wasn't a lot of fun. I guess put it that way. Like I said, those teenage years when I started to become active, and that was at the very first celebrity center, not the one that you see, the big blue building and the one on Franklin Avenue in Los Angeles. But this was down in the downtown Los Angeles area in a very old building that they bought and repurposed. And that was at the very beginning of trying to get celebrities involved in Scientology. Long before Tom Cruise, a little bit even before when John Travolta first came in. And so that's when I became involved in that my parents could no longer pay good money to go. My parents could no longer participate. And so I was, I always say voluntold that I was given up. Then you go, send your daughter. And that's how my beginning, in Scientology happened. So it was a life that I chose, Jesse, to shut the door on. So after I left, I chose to say that never happened to me. That's over. And to, recreate myself. My family was out by that time. My father passed, when I was 19. And I became an educator. I got married. I had a family. I lived what I termed we use your quotes, a normal, right? life. And really didn't know that I had this trauma. Really, I mean, I guess I knew, but I didn't know on a conscious level that I had this trauma, and I chose to bury it.
Well, yeah. And sometimes unconsciously, at least what I've learned with PTSD, which most people that leave cults end up having PTSD, or if you're just autistic, that comes natural at birth. But the PTSD does block and keep certain feelings or traumas away, anyways, until your brain decides, oh, it's okay. Or if sometimes it's something just happening in life triggers that emotion or memory that leads to, oh, cool, I guess this did happen. But that makes sense. And I'm glad that you took the healing journey and are talking about it and educating people using your education skills to
Well,
educate others.
thank you. Thank you. Like I said, it's not a story I ever thought I was going to write. I never thought I would speak out. I never thought I would say anything about it. I thought it would be buried forever. And like you said, because of a traumatic event, that's what activated everything. And I really had no choice, is how I feel. I feel like if I had not dealt with it and somehow come to terms with what happened to me and how it happened to me, I would not have been able to heal. And like you said, as an educator, it had to make sense to me. I had to figure out the why, why is this happening? And why did this happen? And I start my book that way, with the premise of, were my parents destined to, my mom had severe anxiety. She was agoraphobic. She had psychotic episodes. My father was a sexual predator. Were they destined to be those people? Or did Scientology become the catalyst that activated that in them?
Ooh, that's a good question. I
It's a
know
good
with me,
question.
at least with my memoir, I do the why, but I also do the what led me there too. Because in my case, I wasn't born into it, but there are some that have been born into that cult now, including their child, the cult leaders' children, Jeff and Shalia.
Sadly. Yeah,
Yeah,
sadly. It's going to be a hard
but
life.
well, yeah. And she's also showing signs, in my personal opinion, of possibly being a disabled child herself, of because she's, at least of what I've seen of their shorts they've done, she's not really talking at the age she should be talking at. So she's kind of showing signs already. And that's probably due to being in the circumstance she is in right now. So I'm really hoping that eventually authorities do something when it's the right time to, since they are being investigated no matter what they say.
Yeah. Well, it's great that they're being investigated because that's one of the problems with Scientology is that they have this bubble around them. Even though anyone you talk to, when I go on book tours and I talk to people and I say, who's heard of Scientology? Everybody raises their hand. When I say, have you heard, who's heard something good about Scientology? All the hands go down. So, the publicity is not good about it, but they have this bubble around them. They have this protection with this tax exempt status. And they have not been investigated and they certainly need to be. There's so many people speaking out about it. I don't know why they don't go and raid, the Sea Organization and see what the circumstances are for children, that are being raised there. There's schools where, people have written their memoirs about that who grew up in Scientology and the conditions at the schools that they went to. It's horrific. And it really does need to be investigated. So many people have spoken out, and that's what I hope is that my story helps. It's one more that helps people hear about it if they're not familiar with it, and maybe to activate, something more happening. But after I wrote my book, Jesse, I had to have more purpose than healing. So healing was great, and healing has been, it's an ongoing journey. Every day
Yes.
is a new adventure, right? Um,
Yes.
but I wanted to do something that was more tangible. And so there is an organization that was actually founded by an ex-Scientologist who has sadly passed, Michael J. Rinder. And he was the person who connected with Leah Remini when she came out. And they had a HBO series called The Aftermath that people might have watched, all about Scientology and things that happened in Scientology. And they really started to, just open the doors widely and interview people and really expose so many of the abuses that happened within Scientology. And so that organization, the Aftermath Foundation, is a nonprofit that helps people get out of Scientology. And it helps those people, specifically in the Sea Organization that I talked about, reach out anonymously. They set up really like recovery missions to help them get out and to give them a safe place to go to, because these people, they haven't worked, many times they don't have an education, they've dedicated their lives to Scientology, and they really can't talk to their family because they've had to disconnect from them and their family has disconnected from them. So the Aftermath Foundation gives them a safe space. It has resources for them, counseling, educational grants, housing, all of that. And so I donate a portion of the proceeds from the sale of my book, Clearly Lies Are True, to the Aftermath Foundation. And I feel like then I have a purpose in telling this story, and people are being helped, and that's the most I can do right now until they're exposed even further.
That's true. And hopefully people, if anyone listens on the podcast, it is still new. Well, at least on Spotify and listening stations. If you're listening and you are part of authority wise, maybe you should check out, start an investigation openly, since it's already openly out there, into
Yeah,
Scientology. It would be
yeah.
great to see.
It
I
would
know
be
I'd
great
like to
to
see
see.
that.
Yeah. Well, there's some great lawsuits, that are happening right now. Leah Remini has one that she's suing Scientology. And so we'll see, we got to keep our eyes on that one. And then there's some other people that have been involved in the Sea Organization that have lawsuits. And then there's the sexual abuse ones, and thankfully Danny Masterson is behind bars.
Thank goodness. Well,
Thank
hopefully
goodness.
some more happens and hopefully this reaches a lot of people too. And can you let them know where they can buy your book?
Yes, yes, thank you. Thank you so much. You can buy it on Amazon. It's in paperback, it's an ebook, and it's also an Audible recorded in my own voice. So that's a great place to get it. It's also on Barnes and Noble and bookshop.org, and that's where many independent bookstores order from. So you can look for it there as well. And if you need more information about me, my handle is Clearly Lies Are True, and that's for Instagram and for TikTok. And then I have a link tree so you can see everything, all my other organizations or all my other social media. So I have a website. I also am on Goodreads. I'm on Substack. So try to make my platform available for all kinds of people. And that's really my goal too. I think like yours, Jesse, to get this message out to not just people that might be involved in cults, but to a wider audience, to the general public, to say, this is happening and we want you to be aware of this. And that's really my message when I go out. And that's why I've been thrilled to be able to be on podcasts like yours. And like I said, to be in Barnes and Noble bookstores. So you can see all my upcoming events. And I'll be at the LA Times Festival of Books in Los Angeles. I'm really excited about that. So that's next weekend. Yeah. So it's a life I never imagined. Every day, when something comes along like this, I think I really can't imagine what I would have thought of myself, a year and a half ago before everything was published. But I knew I had to speak out. And so I need to do this work. And I'm just so thankful that, you're doing it as well.
Well, thank you for telling some of your story and for everything you're doing too. I'll also make sure to leave links, at least not only in the YouTube posts that I do, but I'm going to try to do it. I'm still learning the whole podcast and how to get things. I guess Tabby or Dr. Tabitha will be my first that I learned so she's resources too for those getting out of cults. She's a good resource. Her name is Dr. Tabitha Chapman. She is an ex-member of Nexium.
Okay.
That's not her whole title, but that's where people will understand. She at least has understanding there too. But she also is towards the inclusive population since her and I are both part of the LGBTQIA plus community. Um,
Great.
she's a great resource too for any cult. She deals with 24/7 and helping getting people out, recovery, getting resources, including houses, like you said, financial. I'm a board member of the Freedom Train, is what she has. But I do want to get your info too of yours because I want to make sure to put a whole resource thing together that I'll also be putting in my memoir and I'll also be putting on my website and many other places in the process. But
Yeah.
yeah,
Excellent. Excellent. I have that in my book as well, a list of resources. I think it's so powerful, to even, because somebody reads your story, it's like, okay, now what? How can I help, right? Where can I reach out to if this connects with me? And so I did the same thing. Yeah. So that's
yeah,
great.
exactly.
And I saw the nonprofit also that you belong to. So there's so many organizations out there now to support these people. So soon no one will be in a cult. Let's hope for
Hopefully
that.
not. Because I never thought I'd do this, but I'm excited. As we talked about adventures, I'm going to start adventuring into gaming more, which there's a little fear back there too, but I'm going to do it because I feel like even in the gaming world and acting world, whether it's voiceover or anything, that there isn't education in culting. I've talked to an actress YouTuber too, and we've talked about this behind the scenes. I won't say her name for purposes of her and I already talked about it behind the scenes of not to talk about it outwardly, so no name, but that there is some culty happenings even within the industry to itself that I feel like maybe going further in, like Jesse's stories, why I have Jesse's stories. Stories are everywhere. I also
Right.
want to help people, not only telling my own story, but I also want to be able to help others tell their story too, but specifically disabled, anyone who's not getting their stories out there that are ignored or unheard. That's why I have
Yes.
the title, Jesse Stories, Unheard Voices. I want to be
Yeah.
as inclusive as possible and make sure we get those voices heard.
Yeah.
And yeah, a lot of
I love
legwork to
that.
do it.
It is. It's a lot of work, but so appreciated. I mean, you're doing all the right things, and making sure that these stories get out there because I always say everybody has a story. They just might not know how to tell it, they might not have heard another story to help them connect their story to that. And, hearing it and starting to learn, oh, that does connect with some experience I've had. Maybe that does, give me some resources, or maybe that can help me. So you never know. You never know where that's going to reach.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I'm glad that, yeah, we had this. And yay.
Thank you
Thank you
so
so much for
much.
being here.
Thank you, Jesse. Like I said, I just really appreciate it. And I just appreciate the work you're doing. So you're brave, you're courageous. Thank you so much.
You are also brave and courageous. I appreciate you.
Thanks. Bye bye.
Let me stop the recording.